Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Las Vegas glowed with thousands of lights that were reflected in the huge glass facades of casinos and expensive hotels. The night promised to be long. The scent of expensive perfume, alcohol, and money was in the air. Limousines whizzed down the streets, neon signs beckoned, and inside the heavy casino doors, everyone who entered hoped for luck. Emily couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed so hard. Her friends were already a little tipsy, fueled by the champagne and the general excitement. They were celebrating Lauren's bachelorette party, their longtime friend who was getting married in a week. It was their night, their craziness, their night. Well, Mrs. Wright, Cassandra stretched out, holding up 2 glasses of champagne. What have you tried your luck? Come on. Emily laughed, taking glass. I don't know how to play this stuff. This is Vegas, baby. Lauren took her by the shoulders and turned her toward the poker tables. Nobody here knows how to play until they start. The champagne was warming. The air hummed with the intense energy of the crowd. Croupiers dealt cards. Chips clattered. Cheers could be heard everywhere, some from victories, others from defeats. One bet, Cassandra offered, nudging her in the side. Just make one, for excitement's sake. Emily stared at the table. Dollar bills in the hands of other players seemed like something frivolous. She'd never been a gambler. But this night, she wanted to try. She reached into her purse, pulled out a few $100s, and sat down at the table. I see we have a newcomer, the man across the table said, glancing at her appraisingly. You're in luck, miss. Tonight's a good night. Emily smiled. Her friends watched her with glasses in hand, encouraging her with gestures. The cards were dealt. The first bets. She could feel her heart beating faster. I bet you'll make another bet, Lauren whispered in her ear. She did. Then another. And another. At first she lost, but then her luck took a sharp turn. Chips grew in a pile in front of her. People began to look at her with respect. She got into it. At some point, she felt like she wasn't just a participant in the game, but the center of it. Oh my God! Cassandra screamed when the dealer announced the amount of her winnings. Did you see that? Damn it, Em. Lauren grabbed her arm. You just won a freaking lot of money. Emily blinked. There was an impressive sum on the table in front of her. Adrenaline spilled through her veins, her fingers trembling. What now? She exhaled. Now, a tall man in a black suit approached them. You are invited to the VIP lounge. Real players are playing there. The friends froze, looking at each other. It's a different level, he continued, looking at her intently. High-stakes elite conditions. I think you'll like it. Something shook inside. This was the moment that would change the course of the night. Either walk away, satisfied with what you'd won, or move on into the unknown. What's up, Em? Lauren leaned closer. You're not going to chicken out, are you? Emily looked at the chips in front of her, then back at the man in the suit. Okay, she said. Lead the way. He smiled and pulled the velvet rope apart, letting her into another, enclosed space where the stakes were higher and losing meant more than just losing money. The deluxe VIP lounge was as different from a regular casino as a private jet was different from a budget flight. There was no fuss, no loud shouting, no cheap glitter. Light twilight, heavy aroma of expensive cigars, soft rustling of cards, and ringing of chips. This place was all about money. Real money. Emily sank into a chair by the table. The champagne glass in her hand shook slightly. The adrenaline from the win was still bubbling in her blood, and her friends were still outside, chatting at the bar. She knew, now was the moment to stop. Just take the money and leave. But something kept her in place. You're new. The man on her right smiled slightly, spreading out the chips in front of him. Maybe, she shrugged, trying to look more confident than she actually felt. First round. A loss. Small but tangible. You're just unlucky, the other player said. Bet again. She bet. She lost. Next round, more bad luck. She had fewer and fewer chips in her hands, but the excitement throbbed in her temples. She wanted hers back, wanted to feel the thrill of being down at the regular table again. Lady, you might want to stop, the man on her left said with a slight smirk. Or raise the stakes. She looked at him. Tanned arms, expensive watch, confidence in his voice. This room was full of people like him, people who were used to being in control. She wanted to be among them, wanted to prove that she could, too. Raise, she said. The cards fell to the table. Another loss. Her breathing became ragged. There must be something, she muttered to herself. There were no chips left. One more game. Her voice shook, but the excitement wouldn't let up. No chips? The man across the table grinned. I'll take a loan, she said. The waiter, who was watching the game, nodded instantly and disappeared. A couple minutes later, the check was in front of her. 50,000. Emily signed it. Next round. Losing. Another loan. Lose. Her sense of reality began to fade. She could no longer hear the players laughing at the next table, nor could she see the waiters deftly serving drinks. There was only this table, the cards, and the emptiness that was growing inside. 200,000, the man in the tuxedo said, calculating the debt. Emily blinked. When? How? Do you want to continue? An ingratiating voice sounded behind her back. She turned around. A tall man in an impeccable dark suit stood at the velvet rope, watching her. His face expressed no emotion, but there was a predatory interest lurking in his eyes. I think we have a serious game here, he said, coming closer. Henry Caldwell. One of the players whispered. A chill swept over her. Everyone in the room knew who he was. Henry Caldwell wasn't just a casino owner. He was the man who ran the city. Unofficially, he was in those pictures in the business magazines, next to governors, millionaires, powerful people. You're in debt, Ms. Wright. He sank into the chair across from me. $500,000. Her fingers clenched into a fist. I'll pay it back. How? His smile was light, but not warm. She tried to gather her thoughts. Her husband didn't know about this. No one knew. I can take out a loan, Will they give it to you? He raised his eyebrows. She swallowed. Of course not. There is no such money in the family budget. Henry leaned forward. But I have another suggestion. Emily felt her heart quicken. You'll spend the night with me. It was as if the casino had grown quieter. She didn't immediately realize the meaning of his words. What? One night, he paused, looking her straight in the eye. And I'll write off the entire debt. Her mind tried to protest, but the fear was already starting to spread through her body in an icy wave. Are you kidding? I never joke when it comes to money. His gaze was calm, confident. He knew she had no choice. No, she whispered. Then people will be here tomorrow morning to discuss your debt. He leaned back in his chair. Legally, I don't think your husband will like that. Her chest tightened. She thought about her husband, about how he'd look at her when he found out about the $500,000 debt, about how everything would fall apart. Henry got up. You have 5 minutes. Make up your mind. He left, and she remained seated, feeling her reality falling apart. The elevator glided upward, soft and silent. Emily stood with her back against the mirrored wall, looking at her reflection. Her gaze wandered to her own face, but she barely recognized herself. Adrenaline still pulsed in her blood, emotions crowding her chest that she tried to suppress. Henry Caldwell stood beside her, his posture as impeccable as everything about him. His black suit fit perfectly, and his white gold cufflinks glinted faintly in the soft light. He was silent, and that silence was heavier than any words. When the elevator doors parted, Emily felt her insides tighten. The penthouse was huge. 2 stories, panoramic windows that overlooked Vegas at night. The city twinkled with thousands of lights, like a mirage in the desert. She took a few steps forward, feeling the soft carpet sink beneath her heels. Would you like a drink? His voice was calm, low as always, but there was something in it that made her tense. I know. She didn't want to let her guard down. Henry walked to the bar, poured himself a whiskey, then turned to her, leaning against the counter. Are you afraid of me? No, she answered too quickly. He grinned, as if he'd expected just such a reaction. Then why are you trembling? She clenched her hands, tried to pull herself together. This is all wrong. But you're here. She turned away, looking at the city. I have to go. Go where? She closed her eyes. He knew the answer. Home. What was the point? Henry took a sip of whiskey. You're already here. The debt will be gone in the morning. Tomorrow you'll wake up a free woman. The words sounded like he was offering more than just a deal. She took a deep breath, turned around. Why me? Henry set down his glass, stepped closer. Because I like women who try to fight. His fingers rested on her wrist, warm, confident. You were thinking of giving up, weren't you? She swallowed. I'm still thinking. You're lying. He leaned closer, his breath touching her cheek. She pulled back, but he caught her wrist tighter than before. Henry, you can leave right now, he said quietly. I won't stop you. She stared at him, trying to see if there was any truth in those words. But she didn't. He waited. A second passed, then another, and it all came crashing down. She grabbed him by the lapels of his jacket, pulled him to her, and his lips covered hers. This was not the kiss of a man who hesitates. There was strength, certainty, irreversibility in this movement. She resisted at first, not physically, but inwardly. Her mind screamed that this was a mistake, that it couldn't be done. But her arms were already around his neck, her fingers sliding through his hair. He turned her around, pushed her against the wall, his palms resting tightly on her waist. Tell me you don't want this, he whispered. She didn't, and she didn't resist anymore. Her chest heaved rapidly and confusedly. Her mind was flailing, trying to hold on to the last vestiges of control, but her body was no longer obeying. Henry's palms slid slowly down her back, exploring, testing the boundaries of what was permissible. He wasn't in a hurry. He waited. She could feel the heat of his breath on her skin, the faint scent of whiskey, and something else warm, masculine, almost hypnotic. Her hands closed around his shoulders, feeling the hardness beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. Last chance, his voice was low, calm, but tinged with challenge. She knew that if she said the word, he'd back off. All this would stop, and she could leave. But she remained silent. Henry leaned in, his lips lingering at her collarbone, not touching, but it was enough to make her breath hitch. Her body betrayed her even sooner than her mind. Her fingers hooked into the fabric of his jacket, holding him back as he leaned closer. He could feel it, read it as easily as he'd won at the casino, unmistakable, confident. She'd expected pressure, demanding, but he was slow, testing her reaction. The parted lips, the rapid breathing, the tense muscles, all of it spoke for her. When he did touch her lips, she thought no more. His arms closed around her waist, pulling her against him. The wall behind her chilled her skin through the fabric of her dress, but she no longer noticed anything but him. She had to stop, should have remembered her husband, her family, who she was. But all of that remained somewhere out there, beyond the walls of the penthouse, beyond the glitter of Vegas night. There was only this moment now, and she wasn't fighting it anymore. In the morning, the sun flooded the room with soft light. Emily woke up alone. A sheet of white paper lay on the pillow beside her. Your debt is closed. Don't lose yourself. She stared at the note for a long time until her fingers clenched the piece of paper with the note into a fist. Then she tossed in the trash can. She got up, got dressed, and left without looking back. When the door closed behind her, she promised herself she'd never come back here, that this would stay in Vegas. She walked out of the hotel. She didn't think, just walked forward as if hypnotized. Her heels thudded on the sidewalk, her fingers nervously clutching her phone. She wanted to erase everything, to go home, lie next to her husband, and imagine this night had never happened. In the cab, she stared out the window, not listening to the driver's voice. Her heart was pounding somewhere in her throat, but with each passing minute, reality began to seem more and more ghostly, like it was just a dream, a mistake that could be closed, crossed out. The airport, an airplane. The hours on the flight stretched into eternity. She didn't sleep, she didn't read, she didn't watch movies. She just stared out the window, repeating one phrase in her head: this stays in Vegas. When she set foot on home soil again, it was quiet inside. Everything was behind her. Everything had been erased. But a week later, standing among the people, listening to the clinking of glasses, she realized nothing was forgotten. Her fingers clutched the champagne glass, but she couldn't hide the shiver. It was imperceptible, almost imperceptible, but she knew that if she didn't concentrate, if she didn't pull herself together, she would lose the last shred of self-control. The hum of voices filled the banquet hall. The soft light of expensive chandeliers was reflected in the glass walls, and in the air there was a scent of expensive perfume mixed with light notes of alcohol. Her husband stood nearby, smiling at his co-workers, confident, relaxed. He looked as if this evening was an important event for him, another step in his career. "You look beautiful." He leaned toward her, touching his lips lightly to her temple. Emily forced herself to smile. "Did you say there was going to be someone special tonight?" "Oh, yes." He straightened up, looking around the room proudly. "You won't believe this, but our company has been bought by a real business shark. A man who is talked about in the most elite circles. Serious, cold-blooded, damn smart." My stomach clenched in sick anticipation. "Who is he?" "You'll see soon enough." She took a deep breath. This was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Just a corporate party, dinner, some champagne, a couple of speeches. She'd say a few catchphrases, smile at the right moment, go home, and try to forget this damn Vegas. But the anxiety wouldn't go away. The hall filled with the light clinking of glasses as someone took the stage. The loudspeaker made a quiet crackling sound. Then the host's voice echoed through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the person who will be the new face of our company from this day forward. A man whose name has long epitomized success and strength." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. He's not only a terrific strategist and a natural leader, but also a man who can take the business to a whole new level. "Let's welcome." The host paused. "Henry Caldwell." The whole place seemed to freeze. The air was thick as tar. She couldn't even breathe. The roar of applause sounded like a rumble in her ears, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Henry stepped up onto the stage. Still the same confident stride, still the same aura of power and control. He wore the same impeccable suit, the same easy grin that made her shiver. He looked across the room and found her gaze. Emily couldn't take her eyes away. Time slowed. Her husband clapped his hands together enthusiastically, his face glowing with anticipation. He didn't see her fingers tighten on the stem of the glass, didn't notice her shoulders tense. Henry tilted his head slightly, and then smiled. And that smile had everything. The memory of that night, of how he'd held her wrist, how he'd told her he knew she wouldn't say no, of the way the sun flooded the room when she woke up alone, about the things she wanted to forget. But he wouldn't let her. He's here, and now he's her new nightmare. A home, her fortress, a place to hide from the outside world, from its noise, from its chaos, from the shadows of the past. But not from him. Emily closed the door and leaned her back against it. The house was dark and quiet. Only the wall clock in the living room ticked away the seconds. Time flowed smoothly, as if nothing had changed, as if this week after the corporate dinner had passed quietly, like all the other weeks in her life. But that was a lie. She could feel his presence even when he wasn't around. It was everywhere, in every glance from her husband, in every phone call, in every new face that suddenly appeared in their midst. The phone vibrated. She flinched, her heart skipping a beat. Emily slowly raised her hand, unlocked the screen. "Thinking of us. You too." The screen burned in the darkness. She stared at the message, but couldn't bring herself to erase it. Her throat was dry. She wouldn't answer it. Never. She would just delete it and go to bed. Her finger hovered over the screen. The message disappeared on its own. She froze. He knew she'd seen it, knew she'd read it, and decided he wasn't going to wait for a response this time. She tossed the phone on the nightstand and walked into the bathroom, opened the faucet, splashed cold water on her face. She looked in the mirror. Her eyes were strained, tired. He wouldn't leave her alone. The morning was ordinary. Too ordinary. Her husband made coffee while she sliced fruit for breakfast. He was saying something about work, laughing. She nodded, tried to look interested. "You know what the weirdest thing is?" he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "The new boss turned out to be a great guy. Not at all what I expected." Emily's fingers froze on the knife. "Really?" "Yeah. He doesn't look like one of those arrogant billionaires at all. Simple, charismatic. We already have a couple jokes about each other. Can you believe it? The blood's frozen in my veins. You two get along well?" "Yeah. We even had a drink after work last night. He took me out to dinner at some private club. Honestly, I was shocked. I didn't think he'd bond so quickly with the team." "You were with him?" Sure. He said he wanted to get to know the people he was working with better." Emily felt a rush of heat. "You're coming to this dinner too, aren't you?" Her husband smiled. "Henry said he'd like to get to know you better." At that moment, the knife slipped off the apple and cut her finger. Shit, are you okay? She nodded, squeezing her finger to stop the blood. Yeah, just cut myself. He didn't immediately notice how pale her face had turned. Her husband set the cup aside and reached for a napkin. Show me, he said, handing it to Emily. She quickly pulled her hand away. It's okay, it's just a scratch. Her voice sounded too harsh. Her husband frowned but didn't insist. Okay, he said, taking a sip of coffee. So you're going to dinner? Emily felt her chest tighten. When is it? Friday. Henry wants to get everyone together at his club. He says it's a great place, private atmosphere, nothing formal. She nearly unclenched her fingers, and the blood-soaked napkin almost fell into her plate. I guess we'll see. Her husband raised his eyebrows in surprise. Come on. You always come to these meetings. She knew that refusing would arouse suspicion. Just a busy week, she mumbled, tucking her hand under the table. I'll think about it. He shrugged, returning to his breakfast, but her stomach twisted in a knot. Friday. Henry was expecting her on Friday. She felt a cold sweat break out on her shoulder blades. Her fingers gripped the napkin tighter, blood still oozing from the small cut. Across from her sat her husband, unsuspecting. Friday had come all too quickly. Emily looked at herself in the mirror, slowly running her fingers along the curve of her silk dress. It was dark blue and fit her perfectly. It wasn't too revealing, but it emphasized exactly what was needed. She knew who she was dressing up for. She knew why she was going, knew how it would end. Footsteps sounded behind her, and she saw her husband's reflection. He smiled, hugging her from behind, not noticing her flinch. You look amazing, he said, kissing her shoulder. She closed her eyes. Thank you. I'm glad you agreed to go after all. Honestly, I think you'll like Henry. He's special. She nodded, fighting the trembling in her hands. Yes, he is special. Especially dangerous. Her husband turned around, throwing on his tie. I'll call the car. We're going together, right? She felt her chest tighten. I'm going to be a little late. I promised to stop by Cassandra's before dinner. He didn't notice how tense she said those words. Okay, I'll meet you there. Don't be long. She nodded, but knew she'd be late. The private club, hidden from view, was on the top floor of a business skyscraper. No signage, no extra people. Just people who knew where to look. Emily stepped inside and was immediately greeted by the staff. Mr. Caldwell is waiting for you. She only nodded. She was led down a dark hallway with dimmed lights until she found herself in front of a massive door. A deep breath. She pushed it open and entered. Henry sat at the table, carelessly stirring the whiskey in his glass. When he looked up, a slight smile slid across his lips. I knew you'd come. She closed the door. Did I have a choice? He set the glass down and rose slowly, circling the table. Always. She laughed short, dry, unemotional. You know I didn't. He moved closer, his gaze sliding over her, studying, almost lazy. Then you figured it out. I realized you wouldn't stop. He reached out, his fingers lightly touching her wrist. You knew how this was going to end, Emily. She felt her breath hitch. My husband. He'll never know. If you're smart. She clenched her jaw. Do you just enjoy the power? Henry leaned closer, his lips almost touching her ear. I take pleasure in what I want. Her fingers clenched into a fist. Do you hate me for that? She didn't answer. He knew she wouldn't leave. He knew she was here because the choice had already been made. And when his lips covered hers, she no longer resisted. Her mind told her one thing. This was a mistake. A mistake that must never happen again. But her body had already betrayed her. Henry's lips moved slowly, imperiously, leaving no room for doubt. He didn't ask, he took. And she was letting him. Her fingers closed on the lapels of his jacket, weakly at first, then harder. She should have pushed him away, but instead she pulled him closer. I knew it, he whispered, pulling away for a second to look into her eyes. Knew you'd want more. You. Her voice shook, her breathing confused. I was right, he continued, and there was victory in his voice. She closed her eyes, trying to drown out the panic that was tearing through her. She'd already made her choice. Henry turned her around, forcing her back against the table. His hands slid around her waist, exploring, getting used to it. I dreamed of doing a sequel back in Vegas, he said, leaning closer. Then why didn't you? Her voice sounded challenged. He grinned. Because I like to drag out the game. She felt goosebumps run up her spine. He knew her weaknesses. He knew she hated herself for standing here in his office a minute before her husband raised his glass in the next room, unaware of where she really was. But she didn't leave. And when he kissed her again, he did it in a way that left her with neither the strength nor the will to resist. Emily's husband was no fool. After a few weeks of her seeing Henry, he'd realized exactly what was going on. Little changes, a little longer in the shower, a little more silence between them, some nervous glances. But he didn't yell, didn't make a scene. He did what he did best, dealt with the problem in his own way. A week after he'd started digging, information came to him that was worth more than any jealousy. Henry's company was nowhere near as clean as he'd tried to make it look. Financial fraud, investments that could be ruined with the right push of a button. And then one day, at dinner, as Emily sat across from him, hiding her eyes, he placed an envelope in front of her. Do you know what this is? She didn't answer. It's your price. He pulled out a check and tossed it on the table. Emily took a look. $500,000. Henry has to pay me. Either he loses. She turned pale. You want to sell me? He smiled and leaned back. You've already been sold. I just want to take my share. Emily's husband knew that Henry Caldwell never lost. In a world where money, power, and influence decided everything, he always knew how to dictate terms. He didn't ask, he demanded. He didn't wait, he took. But this morning was different. He sat at his massive desk, lazily scrolling a gold pen in his fingers. In front of him, arms folded across his chest, stood Emily's husband. You don't seem to get it. Henry's voice was even lazy, but there was menace in his eyes. I don't pay for women. I buy them. It's not the same thing. The husband grinned, pulling an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. And you don't seem to have realized that this time you're not the one putting the price on it. He tossed the papers on the table. Henry unfolded them slowly, sliding his eyes over the lines. Papers, financial statements, contracts, hidden fees. Those things that weren't supposed to fall into the wrong hands. Interesting, wasn't it? Emily's husband leaned a little closer, resting his head on the desk. It took me a week to put this together. All I needed was a couple of the right questions, a couple of people who hate you enough to turn in some paperwork. Henry looked up slowly. Are you threatening me? No, his interlocutor grinned. I'm giving you a deal. And what is it? The husband threw the paper on the table again. A check. $500,000. I want that money. Right now. Henry didn't move. You want me to buy your wife? You already bought her. I just want my share. The room grew tense. Henry leaned forward slowly, interlocking his fingers. And if I say no, then it goes to the press, to the Financial Investigation Commission, into the hands of people who'd be interested in digging into your dirty deeds. Henry looked straight into the eyes of the man who was supposed to be the victim, a man who, by all the rules of the game, should have fallen defeated. But tonight at the table, he was on the losing end. He glanced at the papers, then at the some sheet. A pause. Then he laughed. Softly, but that laugh made a cold sweat run down Emily's back, who'd been standing by the door the whole time. She could see his brain working. He'd lost this round, but he wasn't done playing. Henry picked up a pen, plucked a check from his notepad, signed it. Here's your money. He slid the paper across the table with ease. Consider us even. My husband took the check slowly, scrutinizing it as if he couldn't believe he'd won so easily. I'm glad we understand each other. Henry didn't answer. He only looked at Emily. She shrank under that look. There was no anger there. There was no hatred. Just cold calculation. Dismissed, he said at last. Emily stood there, unable to move. Her husband had already left, taking the check and his dignity with him. But the door he'd left through was closed to her forever. She wanted to follow him, to say something, but she couldn't. The words stuck in her throat. Emily, you're staying. You're officially mine now. I've paid for you twice. Henry's voice was as calm as ever. He didn't raise his tone, didn't demand, didn't threaten. He was simply stating a fact. Her heart pounded frantically in her chest. You can't. Me? He grinned, stepping around the table. I can do anything, Emily. He stepped closer, catching her gaze. Or do you still believe in freedom? She swallowed. You can leave if you want. Let's just think about where. He spoke calmly, slowly. There was no hurry in his voice. He already knew the answer. You can go back to your husband. But will he take you back if you swear it was a mistake? If you beg? Henry tilted his head, studying her reaction. Now he knows how much you're worth. He doesn't need you anymore. Emily squirmed. You could just disappear, live somewhere else in another city, work as a what? A teacher? A secretary? You think I won't find you? Her lips opened slightly, but she didn't say a word. Or you can stay here. He looked at her in a way that sent shivers down her spine. From the minute you said yes to me in Vegas, you belong to me. Now it's just made official. She sighed convulsively. You want to make a thing out of me? I want you to stop lying to yourself. He stepped very close, ran his fingers along her wrist. When you walked into that office, you already knew how it was going to end. No. Yes. His voice was quiet, but incredibly firm. She looked away, but he took her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes. Tell him you don't want to be here. She couldn't say it. He smiled. Exactly. She felt everything crumble inside. How the world she was trying to hold on to was already shattered. And now what? She whispered. Henry let go of her face, took a step back, and gestured to the door leading to his private suite. Now you'll start to get used to it. She stared at him, realizing this was no longer a game. He had won twice. She had lost forever, and there was no more way out. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.